Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by two guests. The first one is Dr. Brian Leiter, a return guest. I'm leaving the link to our first interview in the description of this one. He is the Karl N. Llewellyn Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Chicago. And I also have together with me today Dr. Jaime Edwards, a lecturer in law at the University of Chicago, where he teaches political philosophy, and they are both authors of Marx, a new book. So, Doctors Leiter and Edwards, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to be back.
So I think I will start with Dr. Edwards here. I would like to ask you just to start off with a broad question about Marx's background. Tell us a little bit about his personal life. I mean, at least the aspects of it that you think are the most relevant for us to then get into his main ideas and theories.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Marx had a bit of an interesting life in contrast to many philosophers. So there is quite a lot that we could say, but I'll keep it short for now. So he was born in 1818 in Trier, Germany, which is in the western side of Germany. That's relevant because it was shortly after Napoleon had lost power, but the region was still very much influenced by Napoleonic ideas, more so than the sort of conservative ideas coming from Berlin. Marx, he was raised in a Jewish family, not practicing, and his father converted to Protestantism in order to continue working as a lawyer. Marx was studied for law for a bit at Bonn for a year, was a bit of a rebellious student, caused some trouble, and they decided it would be better to send him a little further away, so he went to Berlin to continue his education. And it's there that he fell under the intellectual influence of Hegel, who had passed away shortly before, but whose ideas were still very much in the air. Especially he came under the influence of what we call left Hegelians, or the young Hegelians, a group of liberal Hegelians who wanted to reject Hegel's conservative aspects, the religious aspects of his thinking, and while preserving something of what they took to be core to Hegel's ideas. Especially there was Bruno Bauer, who Marx came to work with, and Bauer supervised Marx's dissertation, which was in ancient philosophy, interestingly enough. But by the time Marx had completed his PhD under Bauer, had moved to Bonn, but there was a reactionary spirit in the air, and it was clear that Bauer was not going to have a position for much longer, and Marx would never have a position in the academy. It's at that point, while he's out there, that he becomes an editor of a newspaper in Cologne, and some of his academic ideas are coming through, in this writing, but he's concerned primarily with very real world events as they're unfolding. And so this is kind of an important early time for Marx, as it's merging a bit of his intellectual influence with seeing these things play out in practice. Marx went to Paris as an expat, as the newspaper was finally coming to a close. And he was joined there by a number of other German expats. And it was also there that he met Friedrich Engels, who would have famously a lasting impact on his, a friendship, but a mentor. Marx would be a bit of a mentor to Engels. Engels would be a bit of a financial benefactor to Marx. But they would have a long career working together, and it was there that Marx really started to reject this sort of young Hegelian ideas. We can get into the content of that later, but it's in this period that Marx is writing the things that we come to now think of as very early Marx writings. And he's developing very early there his theory of historical materialism, which we'll talk about, of course, and etc. So, to wrap that up, he is forced to flee Paris, goes to Belgium for a time.
What years are these, Jamie? You ought to throw the years in.
This is, 1844, 1845, 1846 in this period. But the German authorities are putting pressure on the Parisians to get rid of Marx. And so he goes to Brussels. There's a moment here, very important, a revolutionary moment in 1848, now widely considered a failed revolutionary moment, but there were uprisings across Europe. It was a very promising moment. And it's in this period that Marx and Engels released the Communist Manifesto. Marx moves back to Germany for a time, but quickly the 1848 revolution fails mostly across Europe. And Marx, together with a lot of that era, that generation of revolutionaries, moves to London, which was open to refugees at that point. And Marx moves what he thinks is going to be a temporary stay, and he ends up spending the rest of his life in London. Involved variously in political movements, some journalistic efforts, but mostly retreating to the library to work on capital and think through these issues. So that's in rough sketch. We can fill in any details, but rough outline. He doesn't sustain much fame in his life. He has moments, but he lives into the 1880s, and he passes away in 1883, having finished Capital, but leaving a lot of manuscripts behind for Engels to sort through, which becomes Capitals 2 and 3, etc. But that's roughly the rough sketch of how life goes.
Right. And as I mentioned, we're going to get into some of his main ideas, and he was very prolific, and he also wrote about many different topics. So as an intellectual, and because he mainly started as a philosopher, but then went through topics as diverse as economics, history, politics, social theory, how would you classify him as an intellectual?
Yeah, I would classify him as all of those things. I think this is very important to him. So he, there's three well-known influences one might say on Marx: the Hegelian background, the sort of Parisian socialist movements that he's exposed to increasingly in Paris, and then the economic writings of Smith, Ricardo, these figures which influence him. And I think he bears the mark of all of this, really. He certainly leaves behind what he thinks is this, purely scholastic excursions that, the Hegelians he felt were taking. But he doesn't abandon philosophy. I mean, it informs his thinking. So I think he's all of those things. I don't know, Brian, what you would say, but I think he's a journalist, a philosopher, a social critic, an economist.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would add is I think his conception of philosophy changes very substantially. That is, I mean, my way of thinking about it is he becomes a kind of philosophical naturalist. That is, he doesn't think philosophy is has the synthetic enterprise of bringing together all the different empirical sciences, speaking very broadly, history among these empirical sciences. And, the idea that there's some special philosophical method, as Hegel thought, right, that is, distinctive of philosophy, he abandons that. So in that sense, his approach is familiar from developments even in 20th century philosophy. He does not think of philosophical reflection as somehow methodologically distinct from other ways of understanding how the world actually works, which is why you have to know some economics, some history, some politics, and so on.
So let's get into historical materialism then. And you mentioned very briefly there, Dr. Leiter, that you rejected some of Hegel's ideas. So what aspects of Hegel's idealism did he reject? And what were the main ideas of Hegel's theory of history that Marx retained?
Yeah. So, it's natural and appropriate to think of Marx's own theory of historical change, the theory of historical materialism, as being developed as a reaction against Hegel. The irony is he actually takes over a lot of Hegel's view. You see Hegel's view, and you get it in the Phenomenology of Spirit. You see it in the lectures that are collected in English under the title Reason in History. Marx agrees with Hegel that history has a teleological structure. It's end-directed. It's evolving in a very particular direction. He shares with Hegel the view that history has a dialectical structure, though Marx was not a dialectical materialist, but that's a separate matter. That was a later sort of vulgarization of Marx. But he accepts that history is dialectical in the sense that each historical epoch is characterized by certain contradictions. And the resolution of those contradictions is what sort of propels us forward into the next stage of history. And I'll come back to that because this is where there's a very important difference between Marx and Hegel. Marx also agrees with Hegel that history is cunning, in the sense that particular historical actors act for their own reasons and motives without necessarily understanding the way in which they're contributing to a historical development that has a certain structure to it. The big difference is that Marx is a materialist and Hegel is an idealist, right? More precisely, Hegel thinks that the contradictions in each historical epoch that are significant are contradictions at the level of ideas, philosophical, religious, moral, economic ideas that embed within them certain contradictory elements, right? And so the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, is the history of these contradictions in different domains of human spirit, human thought, right? And how the resolution of those contradictions leads to the next stage. This is what Marx rejects entirely, right? For Marx, the ideas, the Geist, the spirit of the age, is largely epiphenomenal, right? That what really matters is the material stuff. Now, the question is what's meant by the materialism and historical materialism. For Marx, the crucial fact about each historical epoch is the level of development of its productive power, okay? And history is the history of growth in productive power, which in turn then is responsible for changes in other aspects of society and human consciousness. Some elements of productive power are relatively stable, right? I mean, human beings today are bigger than human beings a couple thousand years ago, but our physical strength hasn't increased significantly. Our knowledge has certainly increased a great deal, but what matters about the growth in knowledge is that it affects the growth in technology. And I'm going to just use technology very broadly to mean everything, from simple tools to computers to the power loom to the steam engine, right? All of this I'm going to just treat as technology. So Marx's account of historical change is material in the sense that he thinks it's changes in technology, growth in productive power, that explains the other changes that we see in society. And the contradictions for Marx, and now here contradiction for Marx is not being used in quite the strict sense it was being used in Hegel. That is, when Hegel's talking about ideas, he really identifies or claims to find, fundamental logical inconsistencies in earlier philosophical systems, all of which, of course, are resolved by Hegel, which is why history ends with Hegel. Didn't quite work out that way, but that's how Hegel thought of it. The contradictions for Marx are contradictions between what he calls the forces of production, that's technology. I'm going to just gloss that as a technology, and what he calls the relations of production. Right? And you can think of the relations of production, and it's more complicated than this for reasons we talk about in the book, but you think of the relations of production roughly as the distribution of property rights in any particular society, right? Who has property in, who owns technology, who owns only their own labor power. Most of us own only our own labor power, right? But in every society, some people also own the available technology, right? That exists, right? So a contradiction for Marx occurs, according to the theory of historical materialism, when the existing relations of production, the existing distribution of property rights, is incompatible with the maximum effective use of the existing technologies. Right? That's what he means by a contradiction. Okay, so it's not strictly a logical contradiction at all. And when that occurs, Marx thinks we enter a period of historical transformation. So let me just give you a simple example. It's not exactly a historically accurate example in the sense that it's running roughshod over long periods of time. Right? But think of it this way. Suppose the technology is developed for the power loom, right? Now, the power loom, if you can get people to work on it, can outproduce individual weavers of fabrics, by orders of magnitude. Okay? But if you're the owner of a power loom, right, you need people available to work on it, right? And under feudalism, right, which precedes capitalism, and the feudalism-capitalism transition was Marx's main focus as a historical example. Under feudalism, right, you've got serfs who are stuck on the feudal estates, right, who work for the feudal lord, okay? You've got journeymen who are sort of under the control of these guild masters, right? And while they can earn some money, they have very limited, they don't have market flexibility. And what the owner of the power loom needs, right, is people who can sell their labor power to the power loom owner and work on the power loom in order to produce massive amounts of fabrics. Okay? That gives the owner of the power loom an incentive to try to change the economic relations in their society. Right? And you'll notice that on this story, the motivation for changing the relations of production is a fairly simple economic motivation, right? I've got my power loom. I've got nobody to work on it. Again, I'm oversimplifying enormously, but I've got my power loom. I've got nobody available to work on it, right? This is no good. I need to get the serfs off the feudal estate. I need to break the control that the guild masters have over these journeymen, right? So that I can get them into my factory to run my power loom. Right? And that's going to require changes in laws. It's going to require changing where people are. Right? Serfs are going to have to get off the feudal estates and into the urban centers where the factory is, and so on. And this then precipitates a historical moment of, conflict between classes. Right? The feudal lords are now in conflict with the new owners of power looms. Right? The serfs see the potential of getting off the lousy feudal estate and into the city, which looks more attractive, and they could have some more money. They could actually have income, right, which they couldn't have on the feudal estate. And so we enter a period of conflict, which will ultimately result in a fundamental transformation of the relations of production in society, and in Marx's telling, give birth to capitalism.
So I have to ask you, is historical materialism true? I mean, what sort of evidence do we have to tell us whether it's true or not?
Okay. Well, so a couple of things to say about that. The first thing is that, contrary to sort of simple-minded critics of Marx, like Karl Popper, right? Historical materialism does actually make falsifiable predictions. Okay. And the thing we know about historical materialism as a theory of historical change is that its predictions aren't always borne out, right? That sometimes we have, for example, regress in productive power rather than growth in productive power. But that's well known. Second thing to say, of course, is that every grand theory of history fails. Brodell's theory of history fails. Vico's certainly fails. Hegel certainly fails, right? That is, it can't account or explain for certain phenomena. Yeah? However, historical materialism is probably the best of the bunch. That is, it has attracted the interest of historians as a general framework for the analysis of historical events, and turned out to be extremely productive in explaining an awful lot of historical transformations. But like every theory in the human sciences, there are exceptions to its generalizations that the theory really can't deal with. As I like to say, historical materialism has a very simple explanation for why the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Which is that the Soviet Union involved relations of production, namely centralized planning, right, that were totally inadequate to maximize the effective use of the existing technologies, right? So the Soviet Union was outproduced by the capitalist world, right? And lo and behold, it collapsed, right? I mean, it does, strangely enough, fit very nicely with the historical materialist view. But, there's an enormous, loosely speaking, Marxist historiography that pays attention to economic classes in conflict with each other, right? In conflict because one class can make better use of technology than another, but the other class, they have to change property relations in order to do that. And this turns out to be very, very illuminating about many historical events. So I think that's what we can say on behalf of the importance of the theory. Of the grand theories of history, it's actually the most successful one. Like all grand theories of history, it fails to explain certain historical events.
And so one of the biggest themes in Marxism has to do with class and class conflict. So what is a class according to Marx, and how do classes develop?
Yeah, this is good. And we've already touched on some of this, in answer to the last question. We've kind of presupposed there's classes. So this is going to be crucial for Marx, right? He says the history of the world is the history of class conflict. So this is the dynamic that's going to move along the schema of historical materialism, so to speak. Marx, given its centrality, we might, of course, hope that Marx is going to give us necessary and sufficient conditions, etc., which he does not do. And so we aren't. What he's going to propose is that history situates people into paradigmatic cases, right? So, and this is going to vary, and there'll be some contingency. So, but we can look. Brian's already gone over some of these cases, right? In the feudal times, you have the monarchy and you have the serfs. As we move into the industrial times, right, we have the capitalist class, the remnants of this feudal society still exerting some influence, and now this new emerging working class, the proletariat, that are working for the capitalists. We can roughly identify these. We can identify the paradigmatic cases, right? The capitalists are the ones who own the factories, and given their relations, given the current structure, they're the ones that can take advantage of this. And so they own this property. They're the ones that can hire and fire workers, etc. If you are a liberated serf now, you can move to the city where before you had to work for a particular monarch. You can now work for factory owner A, factory owner B, factory owner C, etc. But the position you're in when you're doing that is you own really nothing but your own labor power, right? So you don't have a lot of options. These are your options. The aristocracy, obviously, the remnants of the aristocracy, still powerful remnants of the aristocracy, they own the land, so they're essentially working as renting out land. Marx is not going to be concerned so much with in-between cases, the sort of aspiring capitalist who may be acquiring enough money to consider going into business for themselves. But he's going to be interested in the paradigmatic cases, and if these can explain the sort of tensions he sees. So it's also important, right, stepping back for Marx, it is to not think of society as a collaborative endeavor for the mutual benefit of everybody. He thinks that's mythology. What you have instead, right, are people who've sort of secured advantage for themselves and use the political establishment to sort of secure that for themselves, to reinforce that. But that's roughly the picture you're going to get. So you're not going to get genealogy in every case of how every class came to be, but you can think of the proletariat as the recently emancipated serfs, by and large, etc. But that's how the division of sort of who goes into the classes works. What you're gonna have here, though, Marx thinks, is right, rather than a collaboration, you're going to have tension. So the factory owners, given their position, are going to be incentivized. They want to take as much advantage of their position as they can. So they are going to be incentivized to decrease wages where possible, increase working hours where they can, etc. The working class is going to be, they're going to have opposite intention. They're going to be fighting where they can with what resources they have to decrease the length of the working day, or to increase wages, etc. So it's these sort of tensions of the classes in competition with one another that sets the sort of relationship of conflict in place.
Jamie, can I interject something? Because
yeah,
can you give? I mean, we do in the book give something close to necessary and sufficient conditions for what a class is, and I kind of think that's what Ricardo was after.
Yeah.
So why don't you put that on the table, because I think that would help in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's so following something like Elster, we want to say something like, a class. You're a member of a class in virtue of, given your stake in the means, your ownership of the means of production. What are you best positioned? How are you best positioned to sort of maximize what's going on for you, right? So if you're a factory worker, again, right? If you're a factory, how do we know the factory owners say? The factory owners are the ones that own the factories and can make best use of their position in the economic structure by, like we were saying before, getting as much labor for as little as they can. If you're a working class person, right, you're approaching the market, what you need to do to get by is you need to sell your labor. You have no other options available. So you're incentivized on pain of starvation, as it were, in this case, right, to go find work at the factory, whatever you think of that work. But that's what you're best positioned to do. If you're a member of the aristocracy who's sort of losing its power in the new industrial revolution, but you still own all the land, you're going to be incentivized to rent your land and make as much from money as you can from that land. So again, there's going to be in between cases, but you can see people sort of sorted in broad categories based on where they stand in the economy,
and in particular on what they own, right?
And particularly on what they own, right?
All right, what productive power they actually own or control.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, we might say like what they effectively control, right? Because that might be a better way to put it. Yeah.
But then, with all of that in mind, what does class consciousness mean?
Yeah, so class consciousness is, for Marx, this is important, right? It's not. It's you can be, whether you are a member of a class or not, if you're in a paradigmatic, you're paradigmatically a member of a class or not, is a fact about you, an objective fact about you, right? You may or may not be cognizant of the significance that plays in the structure, right? You may know, right? I'm a worker. I know I have to go work for a salary to make a living. I know that part, but you're not thinking about necessarily. You're not thinking about the role of all the other workers, et cetera, et cetera. You're not stepping back to think about sort of the incentive structure of the economy as a whole and the way it's organized and maybe the ways that you're pitted against, et cetera. Those sort of things you're not necessarily conscious of. But Marx says you can become conscious of. So, for instance, he thought the peasants in France were a class, but did not have class consciousness, in part because they were separated on farms, they weren't interacting with one another, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a true fact about them that they were a member of a class, but they weren't thinking about it in terms of, they weren't making conscious to themselves, hey, I'm a member of a class, these are my interests are in fact pitted against this other group, perhaps we should organize, et cetera, leverage what we can to sort of maximize our benefits.
Can I interject just on that? Because I think that touches on the crucial thing.
Yeah.
I mean, to be conscious of your membership in a class is to be conscious that in virtue of your position in the economy, right, you have certain interests, and these interests are shared with other people who are in the same economic position.
Right.
And that's what class consciousness means. And this is why they thought, Marx and Engels thought of the Communist Party as the instrumentality for producing class consciousness, for helping the vast number of laborers in the new industrial economy understand that they had similar economic interests and that their economic interests were totally opposed to the economic interests of the factory owners, the capitalists that they worked for. I think that's the crux of class consciousness, is consciousness of what your shared interests are given your economic position.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and then how does Marx characterize capitalism, and what are perhaps the main positive and negative aspects of capitalism that he identifies?
Okay. I guess I'll try to take that one to start, but Jamie, feel free to jump in. Okay, so it's very important for Marx that, capitalism represents a distinctive way of organizing production in a society. Okay. And the distinctive feature of capitalism for Marx is not just that you have people who, own. Whoops. Are we still there?
Yes.
Sorry,
yeah.
The screen just disappeared. Should I start again, Ricardo?
I mean, I didn't miss anything from that you said. So
sorry, my screen disappeared.
No problem.
The distinctive feature of capitalism is that he defines it in terms of an exchange relation. One kind of exchange relation is where I do some work, right, in order to buy a commodity, some object that I just want to use for myself. Okay. Mm-hmm. And the distinctive thing about capitalism is that the ultimate object of it is not simply to get something, right, that I can immediately use, right? To buy a chicken, cook it, and eat it, and it's gone, right? The distinctive feature of capitalism is that capitalists engage in exchange in order to get more money, capital, right? So the form of capitalist exchange is the capitalists lay out money to buy technology, rent a factory, rent land, hire workers, produce a commodity, not to be used by me, the capitalist, but to be sold in order to get more money, right? That's really the distinctive thing, is that the entire raison d'etre of capitalists is to engage in production in order to produce more money at the end, more than what they put in at the start. So he describes it as, it's M, money to purchase commodities to get M prime, that is extra money at the end. All right. Commodities is a term of art for Marx. Commodity is something that is produced with the intention of selling it to someone else, right? So it's not simply production for personal use. Commodity production exists prior to capitalism, but capitalism organizes it in this very distinctive form where commodity production occurs at the behest of capitalists who are looking to get more money as the outcome of that process, and then to start the whole sequence once again. Okay. Now, why is capitalism important in the history of the world? Well, a very simple-minded way of putting it would be without capitalism, no communism, right? Which is why the question is capitalism good or bad is not a Marx question, right? Without capitalism, communism is impossible. And we'll return to why that is. It's actually related to the most positive thing about capitalism, which is Marx thinks that this incentive structure where you want to, as a capitalist, you want to spend money in order to engage in a productive process that will get you more money out in the end, creates a remarkable incentive for people to try to develop technology, right? Because think of the question, how do I get more money out of the productive process than I put into it in the first place, right? I have certain fixed costs, right? I have to pay for labor power, right? I have to pay for the technology, the maintenance of it, the acquisition of it, and so on. I can sometimes, reduce what I pay the workers, right, which will increase my profit margin. Sometimes I can get the workers to work more for the same wage, right, and so they produce more. That'll increase my profit margin. But other times I can invest in technology that will allow the same workers at the same wage to produce much more than they could have otherwise. Okay? Let me go back to our power loom example, right? You could have 100 individual weavers working away in your factory, or you could have just 5 of them working the power loom, and they'll produce the exact same quantity of goods. Okay? This, Marx thinks, creates an endless incentive for capitalists to innovate in technology, because that is one of the ways in which they increase their profit margins, and increasing their profit margin is the point of the whole exercise. The whole exercise is meant to produce more money. Okay. And this is where Marx, agrees with my colleagues in the Chicago School of Economics that capitalism, right, is the most productive, economically productive system in the history of humanity, right? The problem, Marx thinks, right, is that the logic of capitalism is necessarily going to have a very bad ending, okay, for the following reason. If capitalists have an endless incentive to increase productive power through technological innovation, which they clearly do, right, the effect of technological innovation is to reduce the need for human labor power. Okay? So it displaces certain human labor power. Marx thinks at the limit, right, at some point, this capitalist capacity for developing technology is going to eliminate almost all need for human labor power. And that's a big problem if what most people have to sell is their labor power, right? If you don't have any buyers, right, you're going to be in a very bad economic state. But the irony is, it's also going to be fatal to capitalism, because capitalism needs buyers. Right? I give you an anecdote that we use in the book, but it illustrates this very nicely. The head of the United Auto Workers, labor union in the United States, is visiting a Ford motor plant where they've just installed a bunch of robots to replace human laborers who work on the assembly line. And the Ford Motor Company executives says, "Look at these robots." And he says to Walter Reuther, the famous head of the labor union, he says, "Try to organize these robots." Right? You can't, they don't need a labor union. And Reuther says, "Try to sell them your cars." Okay. And that was in a way the essential point Marx was making, is if you displace human labor power to too great an extent, right, there's going to be no one to purchase the commodities you produce. And at that point, capitalism is over. Right? Capitalism is over because the whole point of capitalist production is profit. And you can't make profit if you can't sell the commodities you produce, right? It's pretty simple, okay? And so Marx thinks that this is the fundamental reason. Now, there's other accounts you can find in Marx, but I think this is the most plausible of the reasons he identifies why capitalism is eventually going to come to an end. That doesn't, by the way, mean it's going to be replaced with communism. This is here when we disagree with him in the book about this. here the sort of teleological view that necessarily communism is what replaces capitalism, where communism would mean using the amazing technology and productive power created by capitalism to produce things to meet human needs, right, rather than to generate profit. And that's certainly one way it could go, right? The other way it could go, of course, is that the capitalist class just walls itself off from everyone else, pays some people for security, and produces what it needs to live very well. Rosa Luxemburg, a famous Marxist theorist and revolutionary in the early 20th century, said the choice is going to become socialism or barbarism. Right? Socialism would be we use enormous productive power in order to liberate people from the need to work to survive and to meet their needs and allow them to engage in free productive activities, Marx puts it. The other alternative would be where, through barbaric force, those who control productive power use it for themselves and let everyone else rot, basically. And we're going to have an election next week in the United States. It's not socialism versus barbarism, but there is barbarism on one side. We'll see how it goes.
So let me ask you then, because of course people use a lot the word communist and communist society, and of course particularly now after things like the Soviet Union and Mao's China, we tend to associate communism with that. But what did Marx mean by communism or a communist society? Or did he have much to say about that? And if so, what would it look like?
Jamie, I'm going to let you take this. You can talk about the two phases of communism.
Yeah.
So on. I think this is more your bailiwick.
Yeah, good. I mean, Marx didn't invent the term communism, right? So this is part of, he's coming of age, right, in a time where people are thinking through these ideas. So people often look to Marx, right? What exactly is this vision going to be, et cetera? And it's worth noting here that he has relatively little to say about it for somebody who's written so much, right? So most of what we get, especially in Capital, is a critique of the dynamics of capital that Brian just went through. It's not a program for the future, what the future is going to look like. We do get some indications, though, right? So it's important for him to distinguish him from the sort of the utopian socialists that he opposed, right? So their project is going to be one of laying out what the goods of a new society are going to be, what it could look like, maybe trying on the margins to develop some little communities in part to practice this, et cetera. Marx was not interested in any of this, and for the reasons Brian said, he thought communism was coming. It was going to have a certain form, but it's going to follow the natural progression of capitalism disintegrating. Okay. He does say things, though, programmatically here and there, and suggest certain things through letters, etc. So we don't want to put too much on this, but he says something. So what he does say is he thinks that there will be a revolution. It's going to come in the most advanced countries, again, for the reasons that historical materialism predicts. Historical materialism, we get the goods of capitalism, but the problem is we have this mass of immiserated people. And so the solution, Marx thinks, is going to be available with a little consciousness raising, will be available to the working class itself. Right, so he's thinking, especially, we now have a working class. Think Germany, England of his time, the most advanced industrial classes or countries. The workers are now together in factories. They're organized under the labor process. There are lots of workers. They are increasingly immiserated and aware of this as they're watching the factory owners increasingly enriched. And so they're able to identify, not only are they immiserated, but they're able to identify the source of their immiseration. And in the easiest case, you can just lock the factory owners out. It's almost something like that Marx has in mind in the early days. But okay, so you have this class that's going to be conscious, Marx is open, and this is where I think he's genuinely not an a priori thinker. Like he is attentive to what's unfolding on the ground, and there are times where he's early on thinks it's necessarily going to be an armed revolution coming out of the 1848 days. This is obviously in the air. After some time in England, he thinks it's possible that the working class could leverage the ballot in order to take control. But he does think there's probably, and now we're just getting into him sort of predicting, not saying with determination what's going to happen. He thinks it probably will be an armed conflict at some point or other, either to take control through armed conflict, or if the proletariat takes it through the ballot, he expects there will be a reaction from the factory owners. So at some point, there will probably be an armed insurrection or backlash from the factory owners. And so it's at this point, this is where Marx is now suggesting two things. So we get this sort of first phase of communism, again, just as a suggestion, not as a program, first phase of communism, and then what he calls the higher form. So at the first phase, he suggests that there will be a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a scary term for many of us now, having lived through the 20th century. But it's important for Marx. Dictatorship didn't mean what it's come to mean now. He thought it would be a temporary phase in which the working class sees power, make sure that they can kind of keep down any reactionary uprisings, et cetera, et cetera. In this early phase, Marx thinks there will be sort of an economic principle that will be, again, he's just venturing here, but he thinks something like a coupon system or something. He thinks the old capitalist system will still be sort of, have a little afterlife, and people will expect to get back what they put in, or something like this. But he thinks this will transition. How quickly this will transition, he doesn't say. He's quite, but he thinks this will transition economically, again, as the richness of the economy that capitalism made possible is really harnessed. It will come a point when the principle of justice, Marx says, is each according to his needs. So it's not going. So Marx thinks there'll be an abundance there, and at this moment he suggests, later, something like the political state will wither away. What that means, it remains a bit vague, a lot vague. But it's something like, Marx clearly has this view of politics as the way that a dominant class harnesses harnesses political power to sort of subjugate the underclasses. Marx thinks in this revolution there will be no underclasses, and so at least this sort of pejorative role the state plays of favoring, of being an unfair referee is going to wither away. But that's sort of that's as much as we're really given of what the communist life is going to be, and this is just consistent. I mean, this can be frustrating for people reading Marx, but this is very consistent with historical materialism. He thinks that our ideas, the things we value, the possible things we consider, all of these things follow from the sort of material conditions that are available. And when we're thinking about a communist society, we're thinking about a transformation of the material conditions. So what direction that's going to take, Marx thinks, is a historical matter to be determined.
Yeah, let me follow up on this, Ricardo, if I might, just put this in, make this very concrete, right? It's often objected to Marx to say, well, people are basically self-interested, right? Marx doesn't deny that, by the way, right? But at least the way in which people are self-interested now is presumably partly a function of the circumstances under which they live, right? Mm-hmm. So think of it this way: suppose we did not live in a society or an economy, right, in which you had to devote most of your life to activities simply in order to earn a wage, right? Suppose it was a society with productive abundance. And we are of the view, I'm definitely of the view, but I think Jamie is too, that on Marx's view, productive abundance is a necessary condition for any alternative, any humane alternative to capitalism, which is why Mao should not have been a communist, why Lenin sort of understood this, but then circumstances overtook him. Russia and China were agricultural societies. They had no business pretending to be communist. So productive abundance is required. Suppose we have productive abundance. Suppose productive abundance is used to liberate people from the struggle to survive, right? So that, Ricardo, you are free to produce the Dissenter. You don't have to worry about paying the bills or the rent, right? And Jamie and I are free to teach what we want to teach or write, right? And other people are free to engage in other activities that are meaningful and satisfying to them. If we aren't locked in a constant struggle for survival, it's quite possible our motives and our values might be very different. Indeed, it seems somewhat likely, right? Just as you find within a functional family, people don't act on the basis of self-interest all the time. Why not? Well, because they aren't locked in a struggle for survival with each other. So too, if it could be replicated at a society-wide level, one might expect that people's motivations will be quite different. And I do think that is part of Marx's picture, and it's why, as Jamie was saying, he doesn't want to write the cookbooks for the chefs of the future. That's his famous metaphor for this. Some of this will emerge under new material and economic conditions. Right? That being said, I think it's fair to say that the word communism has been so damaged by the tyrants of the 20th century that Marx needs a new word to describe this kind of humane way of organizing social production, because there's just no way around the fact that, between Stalin and Mao, and the tyrants in East Europe, Ceausescu and so on, right? Communism is damaged goods as a concept. So we need a different concept to describe circumstances where immense productive power is used in order to free people to engage in the kind of activities they want to engage in, rather than giving over their lives to work they would rather not do if given the choice, which is the lives of most people. Right? I mean, there's just no way around that. And of course, it's never discussed, in democracies that way, but that is the reality that Marx is very alert to, that people spend their entire lives coerced, in effect, by the marketplace to do things they probably really don't want to do, but they have to do on pain of, immiseration, starvation, and so on.
So, but sort of related to that, Marx was also interested in what constitutes a good life for humans. And before we get into the good life itself, let me ask you, because this is very interesting to me, because there are many people out there who I hear accusing Marx of denying human nature, of being an extreme environmentalist, so to speak, when it comes to psychology, sociology, for example. So did he recognize any kind of human nature?
Yeah. So the answer to that is quite clearly yes. Now I think the critics you allude to, who, the most famous, right? Steven Pinker, right, says some people think that human beings are a blank slate. And Marx certainly didn't think they were a blank slate. What he does think is that some attributes that are said to be features of human nature are often artifacts of particular social economic forms of organization. That was my point about the example of the rational man of economics, right, is always instrumentally rational in trying to get what he wants, okay? And under capitalism, that's exactly how you better be, or you'll be destroyed, okay? Does that mean that people by nature are that way, or that people act that way under circumstances where that's the condition of economic survival? So that Marx is quite skeptical about, right? And I think you've got to be skeptical about that. On the other hand, he has a very substantive view about human nature. He articulates it primarily, explicitly in his early work of the 1844 period, But some of the ideas remain in the background all the way into the mature Marx. He kind of stops writing about it. He loses interest in it, in part because of one of his differences with the left young Hegelians Jamie talked about earlier, which is he doesn't think moral exhortation is going to change anything. Right? Societies don't change because you give a good sermon. Right? Societies change when the material circumstances are ripe for them to change, and then you need to appeal to the self-interest of the largest economic class. That's where class consciousness comes in. Yeah. But in the early writings, he spells this out, right? So one of the things he thinks, and this is the core to his view, and it's a view that he shares with Hegel, he shares with many of the ancient Greek philosophers, especially Aristotle, is the idea that for human beings to lead a good life, right, to flourish, as we often say, is for them to realize their essential nature. Okay, so right there, if that's the case, then you got to know what is their essential nature. Mm-hmm. And Marx thinks the essential nature of human beings is that they want to engage in productive activity. Right? That it is not in the nature of human beings to lie on the sofa all day and watch television. Okay. That doesn't mean there may not be some people like that, and it certainly doesn't deny that people who are ground down by a life in the capitalist marketplace may have energy for nothing else but lying on the sofa at the end of the day. Right? But Marx doesn't think that's what people are essentially like. He says he thinks people essentially want to produce, right? And in particular, he thinks, and this is really the most striking claim I think that you find in Marx, and that survives into the late Marx as well, is that human beings not only want to produce, but they like to produce things for aesthetic reasons, right? Because they are aesthetically satisfying, because they're beautiful, because they're pleasing. Two interesting facts that I think speak to this. One is that we know that throughout the history of humankind, human beings have engaged in productive activity, have made things simply because they were beautiful. Even under the most difficult material circumstances, right? People did this. Human beings, right? Cave drawings, right? I mean, wherever you find human beings, they make certain things for aesthetic reasons, right? Their aesthetic tastes may be very different, but they make them because they're pleasing, they're beautiful, they're satisfying in a different way. The other fact that I think is very telling about this is the way we educate children. So when children first go to school, at the age of 4 or 5 or 6, there's always a lot of time given to them for artwork, right? And here's the thing about artwork time. You don't have to force children to do it. Nobody has to say, if you don't do it, you won't get your snack. They like it. Children instinctively, they like coloring, making things with clay. It's very appealing to them, right? This too suggests that he's onto something very important about human beings, that human beings really have a very profound need to produce things for reasons of aesthetic satisfaction. Okay. Now in the early Marx, he makes other claims about what the essential needs of human beings are. So he's got, it's a more complicated picture, but I think the two crucial ideas that I think he always holds to is that human beings are by nature productive, and that they like to produce things for aesthetic reasons, right? And Marx thinks this is the big difference between human beings and other animals, right? Is that other animals produce strictly for need, whereas human beings, if given the chance, will produce for aesthetic reasons. So it's a pretty rich, it's a robust picture of what human beings are essentially like. That being said, I will say that I do think Marx is probably a bit naive about other aspects of human beings. This is sort of the big dividing line between Marxists and Freudians, right? I mean, Freud thought that human beings, were instinctively aggressive. And he didn't think it was just an artifact of the way society was organized. And, my own inclination is to think that, unfortunately, Freud is probably more right than Marx when it comes to this. But it's wrong to say Marx doesn't have a view of human nature. He clearly does.
So related to that, Related to that, and again, this occurs in the context of capitalism, according to Marx, a very Marxian term as well is alienation. So what is alienation and how does alienation occur?
Okay. So the early Marx is very interested in the concept of alienation or entfremdung, which is estrangement. Sometimes in English it's translated as estrangement. To be alienated is to be alienated from your essential nature. Okay? That's what alienation is, right? So if you cannot express or realize your essential nature, right, then you are in a state of alienation. Under capitalism, most people engage in productive activity not to express their essential nature, but to survive. In that sense, people are always alienated under capitalism because their productive activity doesn't really belong to them. I mean, literally, it's owned by the capitalist, who's ever paying, their wage. What they produce is owned by the capitalist. It's not even theirs, right? And their productive activity itself is not productive activity they would engage in if they didn't need the wage to survive. Right? So in that sense, people are profoundly alienated under capitalism. And notice that in that way of characterizing alienation, and there's more we could say about it, which we do discuss in chapter 6 of the book, but in that way of characterizing alienation, alienation is not primarily a matter of how you feel, right? That is, people can be alienated from their essential nature and feel perfectly fine about it, right? That is, until they acquire class consciousness and they realize that they're spending their whole life doing things they would rather not do, except they have to in order to survive. But that's the basic idea of alienation, and again, it's very tightly connected to his notion of human nature.
So going back a little bit, I would like to ask you now about Marx's ideas about ideology. So going back for a second to historical materialism, how do material conditions lead to differences in ideas, culture, values, basically what Marx called the superstructure?
Mm-hmm. You want to take that, Jamie?
Yeah, sure. Good. Right. So it's a bit of a thorny issue, obviously, but what we have going on, I mean, just to tie it very closely to the historical materialism account, right? Marx has the idea that in those cases, right. So in those cases, you're going to have, in the case, think of the monarchy or something, right? You have this feudal regime. They own the land. They have the land, and they're going to. Ricardo, do you have?
Let me say something quick while Jamie solves the feedback problem, and then I give it back to Jamie. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, the basic idea is that the dominant moral, political, philosophical, religious, economic ideas in any society are the ones that serve the interest of the dominant class in that society. Right? That's the basic idea, and that's where I'm sure Jamie was going with that example. So now, Jamie, hopefully you're done echoing.
Yeah. Okay.
Your example.
All right. We'll see. Right. So just like Brian said, right. So you're going to have so in the times of feudalism, you're going to now have a set of ideas that are going to be the ideas that get traction in culture. And Marx predicts that what you're going to get are going to be ideas that reinforce the status quo. And this is what you get. So, right, if you look at in the times of feudalism, you're going to have you're going to go to the church, and the church is going to tell you, be good, and your reward will be in heaven. And what you need to do right now is recognize that the king or the queen is God's representative on earth, et cetera, et cetera. You're going to have the music of the time, the painting of the time are going to be in some sense, not on purpose propaganda, but so steeped in this culture that they're going to be reproducing it in some ways, right? So there'll be odes to the greatness of the king and the queen and et cetera, et cetera. And then when we switch into capitalism, that will disappear. And you're going to instead have ideas about the valorization of, rather than knowing your place in the universe, there will be ideas about being free, where Marx is going to think this means you're free to leave the land to go work for the factory owners. But these kind of things, this valorization of the new ideal as opposed to the old ideal. But so that's in the sense that ideology is tied to the material conditions, right? It's the material conditions are sort of generating a situation that's then expressed in the culture of the times. That's how it's tied to the material conditions. But the idea itself, right, is more complicated than that a bit in Marx. So in Marx we get he doesn't quite come out and define the term, but he uses it frequently. So the chore is to sort of see what's common throughout his various uses of the term. What we suggest is that throughout the various uses, there's a core component for ideology. There's an epistemic component, namely ideologies are complexes of beliefs, but importantly, some of the beliefs are going to be false for Marx. So not every component will be false, but importantly, you'll be able to look at an ideological belief, and there will be a room for epistemic critique. You can say, this is false. This is not true about the nature of humans or the nature of this particular economic situation, or et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that's one component. Marx is very interested, though, not just in saying that the views of his opponents are false, but he thinks it's an important thing to understand how they came to be false. And this will be very important for Marx because he accuses wide swaths of the community to be in the grips of ideological belief, right? So for instance, the economics department, the theology department, the et cetera. So the question is going to be for Marx, he wants to say a lot of these beliefs are false, core aspects of these beliefs are false, and not just accidentally so, but systematically so. Even people working sort of in enclaves separate from one another, he thinks, theorizing in a particular time are going to come to make the same sorts of mistakes. So it's epistemically false. There's going to be some account of the genesis of these beliefs, how it could be that they came to be false. And there's going to be a functional component in all of the cases. It's going to be the case that these beliefs are false. We can explain their genesis, but they also serve to promote or at least sustain the interests of the ruling class who have monopolized political power. So that's the rough schema. In the early days, we get this very early with Marx when he is first becoming critical of the young Hegelians. Again, his remarks are scathing. It's important to remember they were a big influence and they included his teachers, etc. But he thinks that the mistake that they're making is that they're imagining, again, echoing things we've talked about already, they're imagining that ideas, this is what they take over from Hegel that Marx wants to reject. They think that ideas are really where the action is. If you want to understand transformation over history, you understand ideas. If you yourself want to transform history, you want to make sure people get their conceptions right, they think about themselves the right way, et cetera, et cetera. Marx rejects this in favor of the historical materialism that we've outlined that he's putting forward. And he calls this in the early days their ideology. It's a pejorative sense in their belief that ideas are really the mechanism of history, and which he thinks is false. And he has an account of how they came to have this belief, but he thinks this functions, even though, right, as we said earlier, people like Bauer were exiled from the academic community. The young Hegelians are imagining themselves to be revolutionary, but Marx thinks, despite what they think, despite their self-understanding, they're mistaken, because the ideas they're proposing are so far afield from actually understanding how historical materialism works and a true understanding of class consciousness, that even though they think they're being revolutionary, they're in fact just bolstering the status quo. So this is in the early days, and this is going to be a very particular, we detail this in the book, it's a very particular kind of critique of sort of the idealism of the young Hegelians. But Marx employs this more liberally in his later years. He's less interested in critiquing, I mean, he continues to do this, but he doesn't exclusively critique people's philosophical views, their ideological views, but he uses it in the sense that we've kind of come to now use the term ideology as sort of still a pejorative view, but a pejorative view about a whole host of beliefs people have, but still in the spirit of status quo justifying beliefs, the beliefs about economic system, the beliefs about religious system, the beliefs about certain moralizing systems, etc., that they're still in the service of bolstering the prevailing economic interests.
So now for the last part of our conversation, I would like to ask you a little bit about Marx's legacy and the influence and some of the developments in Marxism that we saw throughout the 20th century, particularly. So how do writers like Gramsci and the ones who were part of the Frankfurt School relate to Marxism?
Yeah, good. I mean, lots to say here, and Brian, obviously jump in. I think it's good to think of there's two movements. There's a movement, say, before Western Marxism itself that's important, which is, after Marx's death, Engels takes up the mantle, and people following Engels for a while, it's really important to them that Marxism becomes what they think of as scientific. And so you get this almost this very orthodox reading of Marx, where everything is completely reduced to science, and it's predictive all the way down, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of a movement that goes more in the science, trying to make Marxism more of like a objective science on the model of the physical science.
Can I just interject something about that?
Yeah.
The last thing you said is important on this. Marx himself understood his theory to be a scientific theory. They'll understand, right, a wissenschaftliche theory in German is not necessarily a natural scientific theory. That doesn't have to be physical science, right? But he certainly thought he was, had unlocked the secret of historical change, and, was explaining how capitalism works. I mean, so he thought his theory was a scientific theory in that German sense of a scientific theory. So what I think is distinctive and was probably a bit pernicious was the effort by Engels, but then those especially influenced by Engels, to make it into the science of dialectical materialism, right? That explains everything, including the physical sciences, which Marx himself always exempted the physical sciences from his attacks on ideology and so on, right? But it is important to realize that Marx thought his theory was a scientific theory. So that wasn't wrong. That was actually correct. It was the particular direction in which they took it. So that's just what I wanted to interject on.
Yeah, that's right. And thanks, Brian. That's important, right? So, so with that, what you have just historically, right, is actually by World War I, there was a large socialist political movement in Europe that's completely fractured during the First World War. Working classes of the world did not unite. They retrenched back into their nationalist enclaves. And the revolutionary spirit seemed to have failed after World War I. You get what you have in the Soviet Union with Lenin, but as Brian's already alluded to, most people in the West thought, no, this is not what Marx was predicting, et cetera, et cetera. And then you increasingly see now into the 30s and the 40s, not only the failed sort of the working class failing to rise up, but the working class seeming to buy in various ways to the system. And so there's a movement of sort of a birth of what's called Western Marxism. It's a loose collection of thinkers, not all of them who saw themselves this way, but trying to theorize Marxism, given what they took to be its failure to predict the working class revolution. So they then turned in various ways, but you mentioned Gramsci. Before Gramsci, you have Lukács, the Frankfurt School. In various ways, their interest turned to ideology, but as ideology not just as sort of this limited causal thing that can maintain the status quo for a while, but be seen through. Instead, the project becomes increasingly one of understanding, why did the revolution fail? It seems like it's owing to something about the thinking, the indoctrination of the working class, maybe even the thinking, the indoctrination of, capitalism more generally. And so you get this move to thinking, moving away from Marx's economics, moving away from historical materialism in ways, thinking that is a failed project, and now thinking all the action is really in the ideological realm, and that's what we need to understand. And so here you also get, and the thinking goes in various ways, but you get a return to Hegelianism, because again, the focus is on ideas in a way that it seems like that's where all the action is. And so in various ways, these thinkers, I think Brian and I agree, that this is one of their failings, is they too quickly think the revolution Marx predicted is going to fail, and too quickly abandon the economic aspects of the theory, focusing on the sort of the mental here.
Yeah, let me just add a few complimentary remarks to what Jaime said. I'm going to put it a little more strongly. I mean, I do think Western Marxism is predicated on a mistake from a Marxist point of view, which isn't to say there aren't interesting ideas in people like Horkheimer and Adorno and Marcuse and Gramsci and some of I'm not sure they're interesting ideas in Lukács, but that's a different matter. The mistake was that they thought they needed to explain why revolutions had not occurred. Okay? And yet it was absolutely clear that the material conditions for revolutions to be possible, Marx's actual prediction, didn't actually obtain. He thought capitalism had to be global. He thought that those who sell their labor power to survive had to be, being gradually immiserated. Okay, and none of this was happening in 19th century Europe. Right. One thing Marx did not fully anticipate. Well, I mean, we discussed this in chapter 3. He started to become aware of it as his career went on, but he didn't fully anticipate the extent to which the capitalist state would negotiate peace between the classes, right? By, for example, making concessions to labor movements, right? Marx, I didn't fully foresee that. But we didn't have global capitalism in 1925 or 1935. Capitalism is much more global now. Some of the trends that Marx thought would result from global capitalism we're actually seeing in the wealthy capitalist countries, right? This is part of the Trump phenomenon, is that, there's a huge section of the working class whose lives have gotten worse over the last 30 or 40 years. Historically, when the new technologies would have, would displace human labor from one sector, but move it into another sector, right? When the automobile, put the guys who make horseshoes out of business, they went and worked in the auto factory, right? But what economists, even neoclassical economists, have been documenting is that in the beginning of the 21st century, there are fewer of these replacement effects. That is, technology is still displacing labor, but the labor isn't getting replaced, shifted over to another part of the economy. If I were making predictions, and I'm no good at, and there's no reason people should take my predictions at all seriously, but I'd say we've got another 100 years to go on capitalism before we get to something closer to the situation Marx is talking about. And it may be more than that, right? And there's huge parts of the globe that haven't been fully incorporated into capitalist market. So that was the basic mistake, was to think that there was a reason, that there was something to be explained that required a new explanatory tool, namely ideology. The other development, and this is the one Lukács is responsible for, which is why I think his influence is so pernicious, was Lukács had a very Hegelian reading of Marx. Lukács was basically the return of the left young Hegelians that Marx ridiculed and hated, right? And that then had a spillover effect in lots of aspects of Western Marxism, even with theorists in the Frankfurt School who weren't especially, devoted to Lukács, still retained, took over many of his ideas about the relevance of the Hegelian reading of Marx. So our book, in a way, is an attempt to restate a more orthodox view of Marx, though not orthodox in the ham-fisted Anglo-Soviet Union way, right? No science of dialectical materialism from us. There is no science of dialectical materialism. So I'll stop there.
Okay. So I would really love to have time to go through all the major developments in Marxism across the past century, but since we have limited time, let me just ask you a couple more questions before we wrap up the interview. So there are now extinctions of Marxism. I think we could call them that, like feminist Marxism. So earlier we talked about a class. Do you think that Marx would have been open to ideas like intersectionality or expanding the array of social identities or categories by which people can be oppressed beyond just class?
Yeah, good. I mean, this is a good question, and Brian, obviously jump in here too. For Marx, what is going to be important, right? The different Marxists could answer this question differently, but I think what's going to be uncontroversial for Marx is class matters at the end of the day. So you might have cases, right, where there are various moves that can be made within the prevailing system. There might be groups that are more dominated than others, within the present system. That seems clear. And there could be some progress made, say, within, a group that's stigmatized, destigmatizing them, or things like this, right? And that all seems to the good. But it's going to be limited. This is what's going to be crucial for Marx. All of these moves are going to be moves. You have a society that is fundamentally hierarchical, and where the economic ruling class is taking advantage, exploiting the rest, right? And so the rest, again, you can fight over the crumbs in various ways, but I think that's how Marx is going to see it. It's going to be crumb fighting, and and it's not to dismiss all of that, but it's just to say that for Marx, any of these changes are going to be just changes within, say, it's unjust, say within a prevailing system, you might think it's unjust that certain demographics are on the bottom and certain demographics are on the top, and that may seem right. But for Marx, what's going to be more fundamental is that presupposing that whole background, which is that it's hierarchical in the first place. So you can move around the positions, and Marx thinks you're still going to be in a fundamentally exploitative situation as long as you have the rulers and the ruled. It doesn't matter who's wearing the various hats, right? So at a minimum, I think Marx is going to say it's what really matters is undoing this fundamental hierarchical structure where there's the haves and the have-nots. Stronger Marx, would also say things like these other fights might be a distraction. This is where things will get controversial, but I think for Marx, he would say it's not that certain political movements, say, are wrong, or it wouldn't be good if they had their ends realized or something, but focusing exclusively on certain aspects frustrates others. So let me give an example, just an example that comes to mind recently that I think sort of illustrates this. This is owing to a friend of mine. She gave me this example, but she works in the child welfare system. And long story short, a couple of years ago in Illinois, same legislative sessions where they're decreasing funding for kids in the system who don't have parents, they pass a bipartisan bill that changes what you call kids in the system from wards of the state, which sounds like a prisoner, so it sounds like a dignitary harm, to youth in care. And that was enacted into law, and both the right and the left went home and patted themselves on the back on this amazing thing they had done for the kids, changed what they were called. Is it bad that you change what a kid is called? No, it's not bad you change what a kid is called. Does it transform their life in a meaningful way? No. And it's ridiculous to think it does. And to the extent that one thinks so, right, it's distracting attention away from the real needs that are happening. Just as a footnote, I teach classes in prison, and in Wisconsin, they have just switched from calling prisoners, inmates, to persons in our care. And that's now become official, even as it remains largely like a dungeon, series of dungeons up there. So I think it's this kind of thing that's going to animate sort of Marxist thinking here. It's not that it's not that we should be fighting over the crumbs, and it's not to say, that's all misguided or something. But I think for Marx, there's a profoundly hierarchical, economically structured system. And until you amend that in some way, everything else is just going to be kind of a losing battle.
Mm-hmm. Let me just add one thing to that, if I might. I mean, I agree with everything Jamie said, and the example is certainly an apt example of utterly meaningless symbolic identity politics, as it were. But the starker form of the question that Ricardo, your initial question suggested to me is, is there still going to be sexism in a communist society? Mm-hmm. Right. And this is a question a lot of feminist Marxists are worried about. And it's a hard question to answer. Marx certainly seems to write as if features of sexism in the family that he did notice were artifacts of capitalism. Okay? Would there cease to be any sexism in a classless society where people weren't locked in a struggle for survival? I'm a little more skeptical, and I think this turns on the question of what we think the ultimate roots of sexism are. I don't actually think there would be any racism in a classless society, because I do think racial prejudice is entirely an artifact of class conflict. Sexism, I'm less optimistic about, unfortunately, because it may well be that the conflict between male and female, even when you take the market out of it, is still going to result in various kinds of discrimination and oppression specific to sex and gender, even in the absence of economic class. But that's just my speculation, and I do think it's something that feminist Marxists are correctly worried about. So just wanted to add that.
Mm-hmm. So my last question will be then, what aspects of Marxism are still worth considering and are worthy intellectual pursuits in your view?
Well, shall I start on that one, Jamie? Well, as I mentioned earlier, right, Marx's theory of historical change has been very fruitful in history as a way of understanding historical events, and I'm sure historians will continue to draw on aspects of class conflict and class analysis as a way of understanding historical events. I think the Marxist theory of ideology is quite important. I think the role of ideology in contemporary societies is really quite extraordinary in terms of what just doesn't get discussed, right? What is just assumed to be off the table. And the only explanation I think there is for that is that there are shared ideologies that inevitably turn out to be advantageous to the dominant economic classes in that society. So I think there's still a lot of room for work on that. I think Marx's basic diagnosis of why capitalism is going to go awry is correct. I think other aspects of Marxist economics we didn't talk about, like the labor theory of value, are just mistaken. I think there's a lot of time wasted on trying to salvage it. Right? People start treating capital like the Talmud, right? And they want to parse every little sentence and so on. I'm not sure that's a productive use of intellectual time. I do think there's a lot of work to be done, and a lot of theorists inspired by Marx are doing it in thinking about how the concept of class needs to be modified in light of points Jamie made earlier, which is that the categories they're more mixed now than they were then, right? So a lot of Marxist theorists talk about the professional managerial class as somewhere intermediate between the proletariat, and the traditional capitalist class, right? That is, these are the highly educated people who largely work in the service of the capitalist class, but are still, as it were, selling their labor power. But perhaps they're selling it for a lot of money, right? So their situation is a bit different than the people working in the Amazon warehouse, who are getting the minimum wage. So I think there's important work that's being done there, and that needs to be done. Those are a few I would single out. I don't know if Jamie wants to add to that.
No, I would agree with that list. I think those are the, as far as the substantial ideas of Marx, those strike me as important. I mean, it does seem like we remain in crisis, right? And so I think that Marx offers insights along the content Brian offered. Marx is also just fun to read. So I would encourage, if people haven't read, I mean, I don't think you should start with Capital. It's a bit tricky, but Marx is good to read, to think through, because if you just read his followers, he seems like a religious figure. But when you read Marx himself, it's an exciting, live mind who is responding in real time to events unfolding around him, critically, but trying to bring all the resources he can to bear on these issues, thinking through them in real time. So even if you disagree with certain, of his conclusions, he's an exciting person to read and think along with, a bit contagious in that way.
He's funny. He's not boring like most academic Marxists are. He's very funny. He's rude. He hates certain people, and he has great fun with them. So he really is enjoyable to read. I think that's right. I wouldn't start. I mean, there are parts of Capital that are like that too, but I would agree. I wouldn't start there. I would even start with the Communist Manifesto. But he's a lot more fun to read than most Marxists. I think that was well said by Jamie. And he should definitely not be treated like a religious figure. And we certainly don't do that in the book, because we think there are a lot of things like the labor theory of value that were, as it were, failed intellectual undertakings but that much of Marx survives without it. So.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course, if people do not want to start directly with Marx's writings, they have this wonderful introductory text we've been talking about. So I'm leaving a link to it in the description down below. And Drs. Leiter and Edwards, just before we go, where can people find your work on the internet?
Okay, so so I have a page at SSRN, Social Science Research Network. So you Google my name and SSRN, you will find lots of papers of mine that you can download for free. And you can also find my various musings on my blog, some philosophical, some political, called Leiter Reports.
And I have a website. You can Google me and it will come up. And anybody who wants to reach out, please feel free to do so too. I'm happy to continue this conversation.
Okay, great. So Dr. Leiter, Dr. Edwards, thank you so much for doing this. It's been a wonderful and very informative conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you for your whole series.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingburg, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Michael Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantanti, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Leira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Allman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbon, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.